After being introduced in World War I by the British as a secretive new technology to break the stalemate of trench warfare, tanks began their turbulent journey through history, a journey that's still ongoing today. As World War II approached, tanks were no longer a secret, and all major nations were building them according to their own theories of armored warfare. When the war broke out, the race to create the best tank began, shifting between absurdly heavy and extremely light designs, with everything in between. But a few of them would be remembered not because they were invincible or overwhelmingly powerful, but because they were what we call workhorses, mass-produced machines meant to defeat the enemy through sheer numbers. This is the story of the three main workhorse tanks that carried World War II. You'll see everything you didn't know about them and hear the unique but dark stories of the people who had to fight inside them. Number 1. The M4 Sherman, USA. Before World War II, the United States thought that tanks wouldn't play a major role on the battlefield. They were quickly proven wrong by the Germans, who used them to great effect in their blitzkrieg tactics, shocking the world with their rapid advance. When it became clear that the United States would enter the war, the best, let's say, tank they could send to the front lines was the M1 combat car and the M2 light tank, both of which were severely outdated compared to what the Germans had. To make matters worse, the United States had only ever built 300 tanks up to that point, with no large-scale production facilities, experience, or even proper equipment for tank manufacturing. So they scrambled and came up with an often overlooked stopgap solution, the M3 Lee tank. They had already outdated 37mm gun with a turret, as well as a 75mm field gun, but they still lacked the technology to mount that 75mm gun in a rotating turret. So they did the best they could to field something in North Africa, where the Allies were sustaining heavy tank losses against the Germans. The 75mm gun was modified and crammed into the hull in a fixed casemate. On top of that, they slapped on the already familiar 37mm gun and its turret, packed 6 people inside and sent them off to battle. It needed to plug the gap and buy time until something better could be developed. US engineers working on the Sherman were closely observing European tanks, trying to learn from their advantages and shortcomings. They needed to come up with a new tank as soon as possible, and it had to be agile, well-armed, well-armored, reliable, and most importantly, cheap and quick to produce in huge numbers. It also had to be light and compact enough to be lifted by cranes and loaded onto ships. So through various ideas, errors, and trials, the M4 Sherman was born. They had what they thought ticked all these boxes, and it was ready for deployment in October 1942, just before the Battle of El Alamein. Around 300 Shermans were delivered to the British 8th Army, which urgently needed tanks to replace its horrific losses and support its remaining tanks already outgunned by the Panzer III and IV. And so, the Sherman saw combat for the first time in the hands of the British. Alongside other tanks, they were immediately thrust into heavy assaults against Rommel's Afrika Korps, and although they were not invincible, the Sherman was a huge improvement over the Crusaders and M3 Lees. It had greater firepower and better armor protection, and even came with an early version of a stabilization system, allowing it to fire on the move with some accuracy. But the most important thing was its reliability in the harsh desert terrain, where other tanks struggled to work. The Sherman was far more reliable and easier to repair and put back into action. The Americans applied their automotive industry experience, ensuring that all parts were standardized and available in great supply, which was extremely important in the field. The Sherman's 75mm gun was much better than the 50mm gun on the Panzer III and the short-barreled 75mm on the Panzer IV. It also had solid protection against them, at least until the Panzer IV was upgraded with a high-velocity 75mm long-barreled gun. However, losses were high from the start as combat was extremely intense. The biggest tank killers were actually mines, and 88mm anti-aircraft guns repurposed as long-range tank killers, which were a nightmare for the Sherman's high silhouette and medium-range gun in the open desert terrain. There were a few encounters with Tiger ones which first appeared in Tunisia, and they didn't end well for any Allied tanks. The stories of Tiger encounters terrified Allied tank crews so much that they often mistook Panzer IVs for Tigers in battle. So, all in all, the Sherman was deemed good enough and pushed into mass production. And when we say mass production, we mean that at the height of production, one Sherman rolled off the assembly line every 30 minutes, with over 50,000 units produced throughout the war. However, on the battlefield, some glaring flaws quickly became obvious. The Sherman couldn't effectively destroy a Panzer IV or anything heavier unless it was at point-blank range or had a clear side shot. And then there was the second, more infamous issue, its tendency to burst into flames when hit. This earned the Sherman some controversial and morbid nicknames that stuck with it to this day: Tommy Cooker, Ronson-Leiter, etc. Let's first address the gun issue. You've all heard about the Sherman being a medium tank with a medium-velocity gun. The Sherman was designed to support infantry and fire mostly high-explosive shells, which were quite effective, while towed anti-tank guns were originally the primary means of destroying enemy armor before tank destroyers were introduced. Also, the Sherman's gun was deliberately shortened so it wouldn't exceed the length of the tank's hull, making transportation on ships and trains easier. So the Sherman was never really intended to be a tank killer. Of course, in practice and combat, you couldn't always choose your fights, and it quickly became clear that the gun needed an upgrade. The British came up with a stopgap solution, much like the Americans did with the M3 Lee, by cramming a 17-pounder gun into the Sherman's turret, creating the Sherman Firefly. Later, the Americans developed the 76mm gun and a new turret for versions like the Easy-8, somewhat leveling the playing field in terms of armor penetration. Nevertheless, the Sherman compensated for its lack of high-velocity projectiles with the sheer volume of ordnance it could put downrange. It could fire up to 20 rounds per minute with a good loader. Even enemy tanks were sometimes engaged with high explosive or smoke shells to blind them and destroy their optics, and a couple of Shermans firing together at the same target was nothing to laugh at when you were on the receiving end. Now, the most famous issue, the Sherman being a death trap. While it was far less protected than German tanks, the Sherman actually had the highest survivability rate for its crew, with an average of 1.3 tankers killed per destroyed tank. For comparison, T-34 crews had twice this number, despite the tank having one fewer crew member, meaning that 50% of the crew was killed per knocked-out tank. The biggest problem wasn't its gasoline engine catching fire after the first hit, as was often portrayed, but actually the ammunition storage. In early versions, shells for the main gun were stored in the hull sides, also known as sponsons, in unarmored containers. This was the most likely place to get hit in the tank, and on top of that, the shells were completely exposed to sparks and shrapnel that would fly through the tank if penetrated. This earned the Sherman its grim nicknames. Statistically, 7 out of 10 times a Sherman would immediately burst into flames after being hit. To solve this, the ammo rack was moved to the floor and wet stowage was introduced. This area was less likely to get hit, and if it was hit, the ammo bins were surrounded by a container filled with a water glycol mixture. If perforated, this fluid would extinguish the fire or at least buy enough time for the crew to bail out. This dramatically reduced the Sherman's tendency to burst into flames from around 70% down to below 20%, greatly improving crew survivability. But once the Sherman entered the war in Europe, it was vulnerable to almost every anti-tank weapon the Germans had, and if it ran into anything heavier than a Panzer IV, it was usually a bad day for a couple of Shermans. You've seen the countless photos of additional armor plates, sandbags, logs, track links, and even concrete added to Sherman armor in a desperate attempt to increase protection. Commanders were furious at first and ordered tank crews to remove this improvised armor, but it continued to be used throughout the war. Crew survivability was further improved by adding a hatch for the loader. Yes, the loader didn't have his own hatch and had to go through the commander's hatch, then around or under the gun breech. One veteran Sherman loader recalled his horrifying experience from the war when his tank was hit in the upper right part of the turret. The shell instantly killed the gunner and commander, trapping the loader inside as the tank quickly filled with smoke. He couldn't move the two bodies in the tight space of the turret, but luckily for him, the turret was traversed in a position that allowed him to crawl under the gun to the driver's position where the driver had already bailed out, and from there, escape through the driver's hatch. This was resolved by simply adding a hatch for the loader, along with springs for easier and faster opening in an emergency. The driver and co-driver also received wider hatches when the frontal armor plate was sloped 10 degrees less. The Sherman's armor was softer than armor of German tanks, and while this made it easier to penetrate, it had an unexpected benefit because it created less shrapnel when hit. German armor was much harder, at least before shortages of manganese made the steel too brittle. When German tanks were penetrated, the armor broke apart violently, sending sharp steel fragments flying inside the tank and shredding the crew, and in Sherman, this effect was significantly less. The Sherman was chosen as the backbone of the Allied armored forces and saw combat in all theaters, used by different nations and converted into numerous variants. In the European theater, they struggled against heavy German tanks, which executed some devastating ambushes. But in reality, tank-on-tank battles were rare. They were widely talked about because when they did happen, they were dramatic and unforgettable. In one of the first encounters between Shermans and new German armor in Europe, 17 out of 18 Shermans were knocked out in just 20 minutes. However, the majority of knocked-out tanks weren't total losses and could be repaired and put back into action. The mechanics, however, were often traumatized by what they found inside penetrated Shermans if a crew member had been hit. The scenes were often so gruesome that the entire interior had to be repainted over the stains of what was once a tanker. The swimming duplex drive Shermans led the way in the invasion of Normandy, while many others were modified for roles ranging from laying bridges to clearing mines and everything in between. Shermans arrived when and where they were needed, and most importantly, always in large numbers. It wasn't a perfect tank, and the US had already started looking for a replacement during World War II to correct the Sherman's flaws. But bringing a new tank to the same mass production level as the Sherman during wartime was impossible, so the Sherman remained the main workhorse until the end of the war. It made up for its flaws through sheer numbers, ease of production, and reliability, playing a major role in bringing World War II to an end and forever staying in our history. Number 2. The Panzer IV, Germany. So where does the story of the Panzer IV actually begin? January 1934. With the Reich still constrained by the Treaty of Versailles, German military planners discreetly issued requirements for a new medium tractor, their laughably transparent code for a medium tank. Under their revolutionary Blitzkrieg doctrine, the Wehrmacht needed a support vehicle that could accompany all their other vehicles and provide them with direct high-explosive support. The idea was that the Panzer I and II would engage infantry, the Panzer III would serve as the main anti-tank weapon with its 37mm gun, and the Panzer IV, now called accompanying vehicle, would work alongside them, filling the gap in high-explosive firepower with its short-barreled 75mm howitzer-like gun. Due to the limitations of early industry, a practical design was chosen, and production began. The initial production Model A had just 15mm of frontal armor and leaf spring suspension, far less sophisticated than the torsion bar systems favored by German engineers, but significantly easier to manufacture. Only 35 of these Model A's were produced before improvements began rolling in, with additional armor plates, engine and visibility improvements, etc. Then, the infamous September 1st, 1939 came. Germans had just a little over 200 Panzer IVs among their 2,700 tanks. They were distributed sparingly with 20 to 30 tanks per division, ready to shock the world. Panzer crews spearheaded the new Lightning War, pushing through Poland for 72 hours continuously. Panzer IV did its job just as intended, supporting other tanks with a howitzer that immediately proved effective. Its armor turned out to be its biggest flaw, incapable of stopping any anti-tank weapons. Later in the invasion of France, in isolated cases where panzers met French Char B1 tanks, it was proved that the 75mm howitzer was useless against armor. But as it was never intended to fight tanks, this wasn't a big deal. But we said that the Panzer IV was the main workhorse. Well, things were about to take a dramatic turn. Production began mounting up, reaching over 8,500 Panzer IVs of all models by the end of the war. The Stug assault gun is actually the only fully tracked vehicle Germans produced more than the Panzer IV, with around 10,000 units. Panzer IV crews would find themselves facing a rude awakening on the Eastern Front in 1941. The German High Command had expected another swift victory, and initially everything seemed like one, but soon their tank crews encountered Soviet T-34s and KV tanks, which were virtually immune to almost everything the Germans had at the time, except for 88mm flak anti-aircraft cannons. On the other hand, their panzers were being pierced by Soviet 76mm high-velocity guns. Hitler, reading these panicked reports, made one of his rare sensible military decisions. At first, the Panzer III was upgraded from 37 to 50mm cannon, but this one also quickly became obsolete. Because the tank designed to fight other tanks could no longer be up-armed due to its smaller turret ring, which couldn't accommodate anything larger than a 50mm gun, Hitler ordered the development of a high-velocity 75mm gun for the Panzer IV, which had a turret ring 12 inches larger. The result was the F2 variant, equipped with the quite formidable version of the famous 7.5cm Pak 40, now capable of penetrating 77mm of armor at 1,800 meters. Thus, the Panzer IV became something entirely different than originally designed, with a weapon completely opposite to the 75mm howitzer. But what about the crews? They were designed and trained as essentially artillery support on tracks, and all of a sudden they got a high-velocity gun and became a designated anti-tank weapon and a main battle tank. Although crews with these upgraded tanks had some sense of relief, as they finally had a fighting chance against the Soviet behemoths, they were about to be pushed into an even more dangerous position to fight other tanks, and there would be no shortage of that on all fronts. The Panther that was from the ground up made to fight tanks with sloped armor and arguably one of the best anti-tank guns of the war was intended to replace the Panzer IV for its medium tank role. However, as the Panther was rushed into production to be ready for battle at Kursk, many of its flaws were overlooked and found out in the field, so the Panzer IV had to still pull most of the weight. Because it was a well-designed platform from the beginning, the Panzer IV had enormous room for improvements, at least when that was possible. An additional 30mm armor plate was bolted directly onto the original 50mm frontal hull armor, and the distinctive Schürzen side skirts were added along the sides to protect against anti-tank rifles, and even came in handy for pre-detonating shaped charges of American bazookas away from the main armor. But crews were frustrated by how those skirts were easily torn off when driving through dense brush. The frontal armor in upgraded versions was now strong enough to deflect Sherman's 75mm medium-velocity shells. By late 1942, the Panzer IV was facing a new enemy in North Africa. The F2 and G variants became known as Panzer IV Specials among British tankers who quickly learned to respect their firepower. At Kasserine Pass in February 1943, they destroyed over 20 M3 Grants and early-model Shermans while suffering minimal losses. The longer L-48 gun could penetrate a Sherman's frontal armor easily at over 1,000 meters, while the Sherman's 75mm needed to close to within 500 meters to have any hope of penetrating the Panzer IV's enhanced glacis plate. North African combat proved unique for all tankers, and Panzer IV crews fared no different. Machines and people were brought to the breaking point in extreme heat during the day and cold at night, with flies and sand everywhere. Inside temperatures easily exceeded 50 degrees Celsius, 122 degrees Fahrenheit. The five-man crew fought from basically an oven surrounded by ammunition, equipment, and each other's sweat. Metal surfaces were untouchable by bare skin, and they could and did literally bake eggs on their armor. They were fighting over fuel and water more than anything else. Sand and dust in the lubricant oil could turn grease into grinding paste, causing guns to jam, tracks to disintegrate, and engines to overheat or seize up. In the open desert, a broken-down Panzer could easily mean death or capture, so crews were highly motivated to improvise repairs. By early 1943, the Afrika Korps was cornered in Tunisia, outnumbered and cut off from supplies as the Allies pressed their final offensive. With no route of escape as defeat became inevitable, orders were given to destroy any remaining panzers to prevent them from falling into Allied hands. One veteran recounted how his crew poured sand into the fuel tank, ran the engine until it seized, then hammered rocks into the barrel, loaded an HE shell and fired the gun remotely with string. This left the tank completely wrecked with dead engine and exploded gun, so it was useless to the enemy. However, if you could ask any veteran Panzer crewman about their worst posting, they'd usually point east. Besides the fact that 75% of all Panzer IV losses occurred there, just the nature of the front and combat were outright horrifying. Mass waves of Soviet tanks charging in seemingly endless numbers and extremely close combat broke tankers' psyche. The subtle -40 degrees Celsius temperatures, snow and mud wreaked havoc on machines and people just like heat and sand in Africa. The transmission fluid became so viscous that it had to be heated with torches for up to an hour before the tank could move. The Maybach engine's starter system frequently failed, forcing crews to light small fires under the engine, then use the inertia hand-cranked starter system. Even fuel and grease could freeze, making just putting the tank in working order a nightmare. Crews improvised to somewhat heat their tank overnight and slept inside breathing gasoline fumes to not freeze to death, while frostbite was a common thing. Ammunition storage was another horror for its crew. The Panzer IV carried between 80 to 87 rounds of 75mm ammunition, depending on the variant, and it was stored in bins throughout the fighting compartment, including vulnerable positions in the hull sides. Unlike late-war American tanks with wet ammo storage that cleared their lights-every-time reputation, a penetrating hit in Panzer IV often caused catastrophic secondary explosions. German tankers called being hit brewing up, a darkly humorous euphemism for the tank erupting into flames as ammunition cooked off, giving crews at best mere seconds to escape. You can find such photos on the internet where crews didn't manage to get out in time. Then imagine that you're looking at this site as a tanker of the same type of tank, knowing that same fate might happen to you at any moment. By 1943, Soviet IS-2 heavy tanks and improved T-34s with 85mm guns began emerging on the battlefield. The Model H tried to address this with additional armor, but there wasn't really much they could do as the tank was now weighing over 25 tons despite being designed as a 16-ton vehicle. On the Western Front after the invasion of Normandy, Panzer IVs fought heavily with Allied Shermans and Churchills. But the tanks were not such a problem as Allied superior artillery, handheld anti-tank weapons, and ground-attacking aircraft that terrorized German armor. As resources dwindled, quality suffered. The final variant, J, introduced in March 1944, was actually a step backward. The auxiliary 200-liter fuel tank was moved into the crew compartment to extend range, but this made it more vulnerable to fires. The power traverse system for the turret was eliminated entirely, so gunners had to manually crank the turret. Now, a full 360-degree rotation took at least 60 seconds compared to just 15 seconds with power traverse. Because of shortages of rubber, road wheels were now made all steel, giving it a funny reputation that it could be heard miles ahead as tracks were squeaking. Manganese shortages also made all German later war tanks suffer from brittle armor, and even paint was in scarce supply. They'd paint just the upper part of the fighting compartment white for better visibility and leave the lower part with just anti-rust protection. Because of bombings taking a heavy toll on factories, spare parts became so scarce that maintenance units regularly cannibalized disabled tanks to keep others running. At least this was an advantage, as all Panzer IVs had standard and interchangeable parts, and older variants could easily be fit up with parts of newer models and vice versa. With factories in ruins and resources dwindling, the final chapters of the Panzer IV story would reveal just how desperate the Reich had become. Panzer crew training had been shortened from the original 16-week program to barely 4 weeks. Even the intercom systems were often absent in late production tanks. The driver training before combat deployment had been reduced, resulting in frequent transmission failures as inexperienced drivers mishandled the delicate gearbox. Young crews with barely 3 weeks of instruction were being thrown into combat against battle-hardened Allied and Soviet tankers. The life expectancy of a Panzer IV crew on the Eastern Front had dropped to roughly 2 weeks. While the Tiger was an over-engineered prima donna that was giving Germans some desperate hope, the reality was that for every operational Tiger on the front lines, there were 20 Panzer IVs. And the average operational readiness rate for Panzer IVs stood at 62% versus just 37% for Tigers. So even when Tigers were on the battlefield, more than half of them weren't working. As Germany sought to use everything they had, available Panzer IV hulls were used for the creation of many other vehicles, like the Jagdpanzer IV or Sturmgeschütz IV, and even Sturmpanzer IV with a 150mm gun. As the war situation deteriorated, fuel shortages and no spare parts meant tanks were abandoned when they stopped. The once proud spearhead of Blitzkrieg had become static pillboxes, dug into defensive positions as the Reich collapsed around them. Yet somehow, the Panzer IV's story didn't end with Germany's surrender. Over 300 vehicles were supplied to Nazi allies during the war. Syria even deployed Panzer IVs against Israel in 1967, in the initial phases of the Six-Day War, ending a remarkable 30-year combat career for a tank designed as infantry support in 1936. Number 3. The T-34, Soviet Union. The story of the T-34 begins in 1937, when the highly maneuverable BT tanks showed their lack of protection and firepower. A new fast tank was requested with better specifications and, most importantly, sloped armor. After a couple of prototypes like the BT-20, A-20, and playing around with different types of suspension and track systems, finally, by the beginning of 1940, the first 2 T-34 prototypes were ready for testing. They immediately proved to be faster than the BTs, but the revolutionary sloped armor, although it increased protection, made the interior of the tank super cramped, and visibility from inside the tank was catastrophic. Prototypes were shot at with 37 and 45mm anti-tank guns, and surprisingly didn't take any major damage. After a couple of months of testing, mass production was ordered. The early models weighted 27 tons battle-ready, with 4 crew members cramped inside. It was powered by a V2 400 horsepower engine, giving it a top speed of 30 miles per hour, and 460 litres of diesel gave it a maximum range of 180 miles. It was shown that mass-produced models were not the same quality as prototypes, and the first notable problems came with the engine and cannon. The average lifespan of V2 engines was just 100 hours, while the first 76.2mm cannon couldn't penetrate standard armor plates. Luckily, the F-34 gun in the same caliber solved this problem, at least temporarily. With its 500 meters per second muzzle velocity, at 1,000 yards, it could penetrate more than 2 inches of armor, which was more than any German vehicle had at the time. Another problem came with the first turret design, as it was small and extremely cramped. Also, it didn't have a wide field of periscopes around it for a commander to observe the battlefield from inside. It had only one view slit and a single periscope, so you would be semi-blind from inside the tank. A good thing was that it had an electric motor for traversing the turret and could perform a full circle within just 10 seconds. However, the gunner had to constantly switch between powered and manual operation to precisely guide his gun to a target, because when using the electrically powered system, the turret would continue spinning after releasing the switch, so for precise aiming, the manual handle had to be used. Although it made the interior of the tank anything but comfortable and pleasant for the crew, the 60-degree sloped armor with a 45mm front plate was significant protection against early German tanks and anti-tank guns. The armor was made of a special steel alloy designed to be strong but flexible so it could be bent without breaking. Also, the angled design made it easier to deflect incoming shells, and this way, the 45mm angled plate would offer the same protection as a 90mm non-angled plate. When the invasion of the Soviet Union by the Germans began, it was time for the T-34 to show its capabilities. At that point in the war, the most advanced German tanks were the Panzer III and IV, and although they had similar thickness of armor, it wasn't at steep angles. Also, the German guns were shorter and fired shells at lower velocity. This made them both vulnerable to the T-34's powerful cannon, and chances of their guns penetrating its frontal armor were slim. The best option against the T-34 was the 88 flak cannon, but they were rare and scarce in this period of the war. The 37 and 50mm anti-tank guns simply couldn't do much against the T-34. So, the T-34 was better protected with a more powerful gun, and even in bigger numbers, but the Soviets were beaten by the Axis, battle after battle. Ever wondered why that was? Well, firstly, being in a cramped interior without any effort in making comfort for the crew made it exhausting. The commander had to do all his duties while also being a gunner, with poor visibility from inside. The early forward-opening hatch without a turret cupola forced him to observe the battlefield through a single vision slit and traversable periscope. In the extremely cramped turret, the loader stood on small metal boxes of ammunition without a turret basket. This meant that when the turret was spinning, the floor stayed in its place, and if not careful to move with the turret, it could cause horrific injuries to the loader. After firing 9 rounds from the racks, the loader had to pull shells from floor boxes, which were now covered with spent casings. The driver's situation was described as inhumanly harsh. Controls for driving the tank were incredibly heavy and unreliable, and he sat behind sloped frontal armor in anything but a comfortable position. And to add a cherry on top of the cream, T-34s were operated by young, inexperienced crews receiving just 72 hours of specialized training on top of basic military training. So the highly organized and experienced German armored units quickly surrounded and defeated Soviet armor time after time, although being almost always outnumbered by Soviet tanks. Even Germans reported that Soviet tankers were disorganized, that they needed much more time to spot and aim at the target, and that Germans could put out 3 shots in the same time Soviets could fire 1. Instead of engaging different targets, an entire platoon would focus on a single one, along with other basic tactical mistakes. Most T-34s didn't have radios, forcing platoon leaders to rely on flags and hand signals to communicate. Mechanical malfunctions were so frequent that crews spent more time repairing the tank than actually operating it. They even carried a spare transmission because of how often it failed. The gearbox frequently got stuck, so drivers kept a sledgehammer nearby to deal with the issue. The tracks could also come apart at any moment, leaving the tank immobilized in the middle of the battlefield. Rods connecting the track links often slid out while the tank was in motion, so crews welded steel blocks to the sides of the hull. These blocks would stop the rods from sliding out completely by pushing them back into place. These mechanical issues alone led to a horrific 50% of tank losses in battle. Although the T-34 was relatively safe from early tank guns, its armor was prone to splintering from non-penetrating hits. This caused metal fragments to shear off from the inside and fly at great speed, effectively becoming shrapnel that severely injured the crew. And if your tank caught fire, and by the way, Soviet shells were more prone to catching fire and were scattered throughout the tank, good luck trying to open a single extremely heavy hatch on top of the turret. For the driver, the forward hatch made it even harder to escape from their awkward sitting position. To make matters worse, the fire extinguishers used toxic carbon tetrachloride, meaning you'd want to leave the tank whether the fire was extinguished or not. On average, Soviet crews suffered 2 men killed per destroyed tank, compared to 1.3 crewmen killed per destroyed US Sherman tank, despite the Sherman having 1 additional crew member. If that wasn't enough, in 1942, Panzers were upgraded with long-barreled guns, making them capable of destroying T-34s at longer ranges. Soon, the Tiger I and Panthers entered the battlefield, while the T-34 remained mostly unchanged. Although the T-34 saw slight improvements, a redesigned turret with better hatches, increased frontal armor to 75mm, and external fuel tanks, the situation on the battlefield was still overwhelmingly against them. To counter the heavily armored Panther tank, the T-34 was upgraded with an 85mm cannon adapted from an anti-aircraft gun. This new weapon had a high muzzle velocity and was capable of penetrating 94mm of sloped armor at 1,000 yards. Despite this improvement, Soviet armored forces continued to suffer devastating losses, with 15,000 tanks destroyed in 1942 alone. However, the Soviet Union was far from defeated. They relocated their armament factories far to the east, out of reach of German bombers. By 1943, these factories produced an astonishing 15,500 tanks, tripling Germany's production. Workers lived in freezing barracks in remote locations, working long hours with makeshift tools, limited materials, and under the constant threat of bombing. These enormous production numbers, where a single factory could sometimes produce 1,000 tanks in a single month, came at a cost to quality, of course. Many tanks were sent into battle without paint, or even without optics or machine guns. Engineers were well aware of these issues but understood that addressing them would slow down the production of desperately needed tanks. As a result, the only changes allowed in production were those that made it faster and cheaper. This was best shown at the Stalingrad tractor factory, which continued producing tanks despite relentless bombing. Even when German forces reached the factory's yard, workers kept assembling tanks that went straight into battle in semi-operational condition. When the Germans finally captured the factory after intense fighting, they found workers still putting tanks together. After the Soviets liberated the factory, they immediately resumed production, assembling tanks from leftover parts amid the ruins, demonstrating just how desperate the situation had become. In 1943, the T-34 was about to clash in the largest tank battle in history against the superior German Panthers, Tigers, and improved Panzer IVs. The crews of T-34s were no longer inexperienced rookies and now knew how to use the best of their machine. With meticulously planned and prepared defenses with thousands of mines, obstacles, and anti-tank weapons, around 6,000 tanks clashed in a horrific battle. Although winning the battle and completely changing the tide of the war, Soviets saw the urgent need for a more powerful cannon for the T-34. Some German tanks received dozens of non-penetrating hits, still being in the fight even after both their tracks were blown off. T-34s could only penetrate the armor of Tigers or Panthers at point-blank range or by hitting them from the sides. So in 1944, the T-34-85 went into production with the cannon we mentioned earlier. Also, the bigger and simpler turret was introduced, moving to a 3-man turret instead of 2, giving the tank commander a slight relief. Interestingly, Germans employed a lot of captured T-34s on the Eastern Front, which were modified to use German equipment. They were also painted with large crosses or swastikas on top of the turret to prevent friendly fire incidents. After World War II, the T-34 was still widely used around the world long after the war, despite being technologically long surpassed. The T-34 evolved into the T-54-55 series, which became the backbone of Soviet armored forces and the most produced tank ever.